Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining today's webinar from all over the world. It's so nice to see such an international group. For those of you on YouTube, hello as well. And for those of you on Facebook, hello too. So it is rather a busy collection of people today, but we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. I've got some colleagues helping us out on YouTube and Facebook. And also if you're directly inside the webinar room itself, then there's people helping us out there. So you might hear from me, you might hear from Diego, you might hear from Yulia. So before we get to that, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you are inside the webinar room itself, if you want to ask a question, just pop it into the Q&A tab. That will just keep it separated out from the main chat and just help me and Diego, who's in that area, keep an eye on those things. If you're in Facebook or YouTube, just pop your question in the comments and we do our best to keep track of those as well. If you're in the webinar room and you want a bit more space, then you can always hide the chat by clicking on the little down arrow on the right hand side, and that will give you a bit more real estate as well. All right, so the purpose of today is, as always, to edit some photos. So the photos we're going to tackle, you can see on screen right now. Now I failed this morning in that we didn't get to all 5. We managed to do 4. So we'll see how we get to today. So I might have to speed up a tiny bit, but 4 is still pretty good. 15 minutes a shot, going through the various techniques. Now, don't worry if these aren't the kind of photos that you shoot or work with. Any of the techniques that you see today, you can always apply to your own work as well. So don't be too concerned if it's not your kind of photo. And these photos are chosen because they highlight some particular technique or feature or process or thought process, those kinds of things. So without further ado, let's steam into the first one, which is all the way over to Alaska. Very apt for those of you in Texas. This probably looks something similar to what you're seeing outside your windows at the moment. So I hope you're all okay. And this is a shot from my buddy Chris Gibbs out there as well. Now this photo is interesting. Let's just hide the browser and talk about stage 1, if you like. So a bit of the process. So what I tend to do before anything else, and you don't have to do this, but is to grab the crop tool, and I like to start off by visualizing the crop. I just find that mentally easier to start in that respect. So rather than trying to edit and then crop, I tend to like to start off with my crop and then I know where I'm going after that. Quick tip, if you right click with the crop tool selected, then you can bring up your various different aspect ratios. I tend to be always working unconstrained, but if you like to go to a particular format or exact size, then you can do so. That just saves you a long press on the crop tool itself. A right click is faster. Okay, so I'm going to start with that crop, and again, before I do anything else, this shot looks a little bit off on the white balance, which is totally common for shooting in the snow. It often comes out too cold or too warm. It's just there's not enough data for the camera to give you an accurate white balance. Now generally snow is white, so I'm going to just white balance off the front down here and neutralize this. Now what's going to happen later is that I will probably mess around with the color anyway. I think I'm going to warm it up a little bit because I can see in the top left hand corner that we've got the sunburst coming through. We've got this lovely scientific effect, which the name escapes me, of the halo of the sun. So it'd be nice to enhance that a little bit, or at least be faithful to what was there at the scene at time of capture. So even though I'm going to mess up the color, I still want to start from a, not mess up, enhance the color. I still want to start from a neutral standpoint. And we'll come back to that later with the color balance tool. Now, next thing that I want to do is, this is backlit slightly. Exposure is pretty good if we're looking at the levels in the histogram. If I auto the histogram, not a great deal is going to happen. The shadows are just going to tuck in a little bit, but we don't want to really brighten our highlights much more because we're just going to lose all this lovely detail in the snow and everything. But as the light is coming from back left a little bit, personally, I just want to brighten up the front slightly. And also we're going to throw a bit of light and detail on here a bit later as well. But before anything else, we're going to grab our gradient mask tool. I'm going to draw up the gradient just from the bottom left-hand corner to something like this, just so it's roughly following that contour this way, sorry, that contour of the mountains. And right now, if we press M on our keyboard, we can see the mask. Now the fall off by default is quite gradual. So it's going from 100 to this line at the bottom to 50 to 0 from the line at the top. And I want to, so that's symmetrical. I want to make it asymmetric. So if we grab on our keyboard the Option key, then I can just pull this down slightly and extend it up, just so the fall off is a little bit harsher, if you like. Not harsh, but just not as soft as the default roll off. So now I'm happy with that. I just want to brighten this area a little bit. Now, if we look at where this sits on the histogram, it's roughly this spike here. So I'm not overly concerned with it suddenly blowing out. It's not like the brightest areas up here. It's kind of sitting in the mid-tones. So what I will do is I'll just use a curve to bump it up a little bit. I don't want to use exposure, as we talk about in as we go through the session. Exposure will affect all tones in the photo by the same amount, and sometimes that's great, sometimes that's not what we want. And in this case, I just want to bump up those tones a bit. So if I just set a point here and bring that curve up a bit, we can just have a bit of subtle light in the front here, but nothing's going off the charts, nothing's getting too bright, but it's just pushing up the mid-tones a bit, but much less on our highlights. So that's why I wouldn't use exposure, just to brighten that particular area. So that's one little trick we're going to do. In terms of contrast and so on, if we go back to our background, again, I want to be quite subtle, so I'm just going to do a little gentle S-curve, like so, just to get a touch of contrast. Again, if we go too far, then we're going to lose all that nice detail. And I personally don't feel this shot needs to be a big, beefy, contrasty shot, because we've got all these lovely tones in the snow and everything. It would be a shame to lose that. So a tiny bit of contrast, again with a curve on the background layer, and let's add, without going crazy, some clarity too. So at this point, I'm happy with my overall contrast just about. I'm not happy with the color, but we're going to come back to that later. And the only other thing is our centerpiece here, our shack, is that it's sitting in shadow to some extent. And it's also got, if I go into 200% for you guys, it's also got some great detail on it and everything. And if we look at the aperture f5.6, our depth of field is shallow-ish. So I don't necessarily want to put a whole dollop of structure and clarity over the whole shot, because that's not going to really benefit anything going on the back here. It would be nice to just make this pop, or if I was going to print this, I would want this to look really super sharp and nice on the print as well. So again, if we go in a little bit more, this is nice and sharp. Even our mountains in the background here are sharp, but it's just rolling off once we get over to infinity. So it'd be nice to target the sharpening there. Okay, so what we're going to do for this, we're going to name our layer, as I should have done in the first place, so we know what the heck's going on. And we're going to start with a new field adjustment layer, and we're going to call that hut. Why am I filling this? Because I want to see what adjustments work best for the hut. So by filling the layer, this allows me to dial in a few different adjustments, and then we can see exactly how it's gonna pan out. So M again to hide the mask. So what are we going to do here? Let's add some structure, and I'll go to 200 so you guys can see better. So I'm going to add a few points of structure, but not go crazy. And we're also going to add a little bit of sharpening as well. And if I zoom back out, we can add some additional clarity to this area. And I'm only really worrying what's going on here. I don't care what's going on in the rest of the shot. And because it's a bit dark, let's open up the shadows a bit as well. Now, by opening up the shadows, it's not looking flat or anything, but it's just got a bit more life to it as it did before. So let's stop there. Now, right now, this adjustment is going over the whole shot, which I don't want it to. So if we turn this off and back on, so I only really want it to happen on this area. So we're going to clear our mask with a right click. So right click brings up those options. Going to clear our mask like so. And then now we can brush it back exactly where we want it. So using our brush cursor tool, I'm going to right click so you can see the settings. Now there are various shortcuts you can employ to change these. We talk about those a bit later, but for now I won't use them because it's very hard for you to know what I'm doing otherwise. So a right click to bring up these settings. We're going to have a bigger brush and nice and soft and relatively low flow. And what we're going to do is brush in those adjustments we just set. So that was a bit of the clarity, a bit of structure, and opening up the shadows a little bit as well. So that's all going to get brushed in one hit. The important thing is our last slider, flow, is going to allow us to build this adjustment up nice and slowly. So flow at 100 means we would get all of that adjustment in one hit. Flow of 3 or 2 or a single digit means it will come in gradually, and the more brush strokes I make will build up that adjustment. So then we can feel when it's best to stop. So now we can brush around here. I'll just zoom out a little bit. And if I press M on the keyboard, you can barely see the mask because it's coming in very softly. So I can just brush around this area. And if I feel it's not coming in fast enough, then we can always bump up the flow. I'm going to do a little bit over here because that area was relatively sharp, and the snow as well. And what we do is once I've finished brushing in, we can turn this layer on and off, and then you can see the exact effect. So if we turn hut off, there's before and after. So it's just opened it up a little bit. If I want more, I could just probably bump up the flow a bit more and then brush this in, and then you can see in this area, I might keep this area a bit darker and then this a bit brighter, like so. So now if we zoom out, turn off hut, you can see before and after. If we go all the way to 100% or 200%, no, it's hard for you to see watching on YouTube sometimes. If we turn hut off, then you can see before and after. So a bit sharper, a bit more detail, opened up the shadows in front, all combined in one adjustment. Okay, quick pause for questions. I'll do my best to answer some. Jerome said, wouldn't brightness do the same? It would, but remember brightness, what was that? That was our front grad, wasn't it, Jerome, I believe. So brightness would do a roughly similar thing, but it depends. If we reset this and we go to brightness over here, I imagine, yeah, it's doing a similar thing. So I think either result could work quite nicely. But for peace of mind, if you want to know exactly what your adjustment is doing, then you can physically see that on the curve as well. Ramon says, is there a way to add points on the curve without moving it? And not a dumb question. You can. There's a preset called 5 points, which is kind of designed for that, really. So if you choose that preset, it just adds 5 points to the curve and doesn't move it. So maybe give that one a go. Okay, let's have a look over in webinar room. Oh my goodness, lots of questions. I'm sure Diego's answering feverishly over there, which I can see he is. I'll just see if there's any common ones. If I want to, oh, that's quite a good question from Fernando. If I want to match colors manually among pictures, can I place one next to it to use as a reference? Yes, exactly. You can do that. So what you would want to do is, if I just bring up the browser, let's just pop this one, that was what I was playing around with yesterday. You can say, I can't actually remember what it's called now. That's embarrassing. It's called the compare variant. I think I know, let's just type it in here, compare. Set as compare, there we go. If all else fails, use the search tool. So it's under image, so set as compare. And that will lock one shot permanently into the viewer. And then whatever photo you bring up, it will just stick there. So that's a really handy little feature. And that's a great question because that's something which doesn't come up very often. So it's good to know. Okay, that'll do for questions I would think right now. And let's move on. So sorry we can't answer all your questions, but I'm sure you'll help each other out and my colleagues will as well. All right, so it's a little bit flat, a little bit lacking in color. Maybe we will do something with the sky, but let's think about color. So we're going to isolate all color things to a new field adjustment layer. So let's call this color grading. So first of all, we know there's a little bit of warm stuff going on in the background, which would be nice to enhance. So if we go to our advanced color editor and just pick somewhere in here, that will just pick up a little bit of the warm stuff over here. So that was my picked point. That dot is exactly where I wanted to, is exactly where I picked. If I increase saturation, it's essentially going to move that point towards the edge of the circle. So if we increase saturation, you can now see the sky gets warmer behind, and we can see the halo of our unknown scientific effect. I'm waiting for someone to tell me what that is in the chat. And just enhances that a bit more, and we can even bring lightness down, and then we can darken that off a bit. Again, it's super subtle, so it's not doing a great deal. I personally would probably not even do it that much. Just a little hint in the background like so, and just to enhance our unknown halo. Also in the color grading layer or color balance, as I said right at the start, I neutralized the shot, which you could argue was a waste of time because if I was going to mess with the color anyway, but it's always nice to start from a neutral start point, and then we can use a tool like the color balance tool to push it in whatever direction I would like. So if we pull out the color balance tool and go to master, very simply with the master tab, wherever I pick up this little circle and push it in whatever direction, we'll tint the image to that color, just like putting a filter in front of the lens. So for this one, I would feel, if I was Chris and stood there in the snow, I personally would think I would have a warmer feeling about the shot as opposed to a colder feeling color wise. Probably freezing cold, obviously, but color wise, I think it would be nice to enhance some of that warmth. So I would just push my color tint all the way towards just around here, like so. Not by much, just a little bit. I probably wouldn't put anything individual in the shadows myself. The only thing I can think of is maybe if we look at the shadow down here, if it's getting, not really, I mean, it's fairly neutral and it's warming up a little bit now because of that master tint. So I think I would personally not do a great deal more to that. So just needs that little push over that way, and that works quite nicely. Now looking back retrospectively to the shot, am I happy with that? The only thing I might do on the background is just increase my contrast a touch more. We had a good discussion this morning about would it make sense to dehaze the picture because of the background. My personal response is no, because that's quite natural to how it would look. And if we did dehaze the shot, if we put some dehaze in, if you like that kind of sky, great, but you have to push it quite a long way and then you're going to lose shadow detail in the front. So if you do prefer more dramatic skies, then we could make ourselves, let's just do a new layer and call that sky. And then if your personal preference is to have a bit more wallop on the sky, mine isn't. But if we were to just do a similar trick as we did before, then we could decide what tools might look nice for the sky. So maybe a few little tweaks of dehaze, or perhaps even just a bit more clarity I personally would prefer, and just making sure our highlights aren't too bright. So if you like, I prefer the subtle sky, but if you want a bit more oomph, then again separate it out into a layer like so. Pascal says, isn't that a sun halo? It happens if there is ice crystals in the air. It is, but I'm sure it has a really cool scientific name, and no one knew what it was this morning either. So I'm testing you guys. All right. I think that deals with that photo quite nicely. So if we hit before and after, that's how it came out of camera. Actually, Chris was smart, because if we look at his metadata, he added +1 exposure comp, which makes sense in the snow because that always tricks cameras when you've got bright snow to underexpose. So good catch, Chris, because exposure is actually spotting out of camera. So that's how it looks, and then a few tweaks afterwards. Quite a difference in the default white balance, that's for sure. Melissa says Sundog. There we go. I like that name. Thanks, Emily. Your photo's up next. So let's move to Emily's photos and have a look. So sundogs, there we go. You guys are smarter than the morning crowd, because no one knew it was called a sundog. All right, let's have a look at Emily's shot of her flatmate and also fellow photographer Brandy Nicole as well. You can find them both on Instagram too, and all over social media. So this is, I think, straight out of camera, and then the previous one, this is Emily's edit. So I'm probably not going to be able to replicate that because she did a really nice job. I'm going to try and do my own take on it, but we're going to look at the skin tone tool in particular, just how to even those up, and again looking at the color balance tool as well, because if I remember correctly, this was shot with a few gels, so there was a tiny bit of color correcting to go on as well. So first of all, let's throw in a crop, because Emily was leaning over by the looks of it. So let's go to something like that. Oh, we're also going to do a nice trick with the hair as well, as I remember. Exposure's pretty good, doesn't need much of a change. Contrast, brightness, saturation, all nicely lit in camera. So I might just bump it up a tiny bit, and also just a couple of points of brightness. If you don't know the difference between exposure and brightness, the next photo and probably the one after that is a really good illustration of that. So hold that thought. So, but for now, we're going to go for a little exposure bump and a slight brightness bump. I'm not going to add any clarity because the lighting on Brandy's face is pretty spot on. So adding clarity is just going to pull that too far apart in terms of, well, if we do it, if we just whack in some clarity, it's just going to be overly harsh, and then we're going to lose the nice lighting effect. Where it does look nice is actually on Brandy's hair. So if we gradually pull up the clarity and back down again, you can see the effect as it has on her hair. So that could be something we can chuck in on a local adjustment later as well. But first of all, I'm going to go to the color editor and just pick on the background. Relatively well saturated background, so that dot is the picked point. So I might just want to play with the background a little bit, but we don't want it to affect Brandy, or at least we want to limit the amount of effect there is on Brandy's face. So the handy thing about the advanced color editor is that we can shape exactly what the color range should be. So if we turn on view selected color range here, everything will go to monochrome, which is not part of that selection. Now this is our picked color, so if we cut out some of the lower saturated reds, that's going to lose a bit on the face. If we come away from the skin tone side of things, that's going to limit it a bit more. This direction, not a great deal is going to happen, but we don't want to cut out anything. So let's do that. And if we bring the smoothness down, that affects this fuzzy area around our border, our actual color range. So the fuzzy area is the roll off into the neighboring colors. So if we have a really hard roll off, then we almost isolate the background completely. but we actually lose a little bit the saturation. So I'm going to compromise around there. And then now I just want to darken the background down a touch. And if we could pull the hue in that direction, you see it starts heading towards more magenta. If we go in that direction, it gets orangier, but that's probably about the right color tone. Just a little tweak like that, I like. Okay, what we're going to do now is make ourselves a new field adjustment layer. And this is going to be for our color grading, or not color grading as such, because with the color gels that was on this shot, it's maybe a little bit too warm here. Skin tone generally sits around mid-tone kind of areas. So with our color grading layer, if we go and grab our color balance tool, which is right here, and we go to our mid-tones, so looking at the curve, just so we can see our bigger histogram, so roughly a mid-tone, I think you'd agree. So in the mid-tones part of the color balance tool, if we go the opposite of the tone, then we can take some of that out. So if we went all this way, that would be too far. But if we just go a little bit away from the center, then we can take some of that warmth out of the skin if we wish. Now, this doesn't only apply to people. This could apply to landscape, street, or whatever. So if you see a cast in the shadows, midtones, and highlights, and want to just correct for that, go to the opposite of the color wheel. So this is just a very minor tweak, but it's just a tiny bit, as you can see. Now I think Emily did the same. Oh, there we go. Almost exactly the same. So there we go. We're not completely too far apart from each other. So let's pop that back in there, out the way, and then we can look at the skin tone side of things. So I see Brandy's watching, so sorry Brandy, I'm going to zoom in on your nose at some point, so I do apologize in advance. So, color editor, let's do another new field adjustment layer, and we're going to call this skin tone. Why am I doing everything on field adjustment layers? Partially out of habit, partially because it gives you some flexibility, because we can separate out the adjustments into different layers. So if I suddenly decide, you know what, that color grading wasn't a good idea, it's very easy to turn it off. It's very easy to reduce the effect of it with the opacity slider. It just gives you a bit more flexibility rather than having to unravel what you did just all on the background layer, if you like. So it's partly habit, but it's part technique as well. So on our skin tone layer, which is a field mask, so pressing M on my keyboard, M for mask, just turns it on and off. The reason why it's filled is that first of all, we can dial in the kind of skin tone edit that we think might be good. So first of all, I'm going to grab the color picker and we're going to zoom in on Brandy, and we're going to pick the target skin tone, which I'm going to say is around here. None of us have perfectly even skin. So I'm a good example. If you look, under here, there's a variant skin tone, probably around here, under the chin or these areas. Skin tone naturally varies, of course. So it helps if we can pull all those together to a target if we wish, of course. It's really good for if you're shooting kids as well, because they often have quite varying skin tones. Babies' noses often come up really warm for some unknown reason. So lots of reasons why we could do this. So I'm going to click on our desirable skin tone around here, and that's going to give me a suggested color range and the pick skin. So the dot is the exact color that was picked on our skin tone. I'm going to make sure we capture all of Brandy's skin tones. So I'm going to expand out this area. So this is our capture net, if you like, of all the skin tones. Now, as we bring hue across to the right, anything that is in our net is going to get transformed to that pick point. So if I drag hue all the way across, then you'll see the skin tones even out. It's also affecting our lips, which we don't want, but it's done a nice job if we turn off skin tone on and off by taking out some of those redder spots. Now, obviously, we don't want to carpet bomb the whole photo with that. This is really just to dial in what would look good. Lightness will ruin Emily's lighting, so we're not going to touch that. we're just going to stick to hue and saturation. Now we can clear that mask and set to brushing it back in. Another technique you could do, depending on what makes sense, if I just fill the mask once more. So that's a filled mask. So you could argue, why don't you just erase the bits that you don't need? And sometimes that's more efficient. But in this case, we only want to do a little bit here, maybe something down here, maybe something here. So that's more work to erase everything than brush it back in. So let's clear our mask again, zip back up here. And once again, we can do the same thing. We can have a nice low flow, probably lower than that, so we can build it up where we want it. So let's turn the mask off. So we do a little bit down here, no zoom, sorry Brandy, and a bit more over here, like so. And remember, my flow's fairly low, so I'm going to be brushing over it a fair amount. Going to avoid the lips because, of course, we want them to be the color that we considered. Hands, arms, legs, skin tone always varies. You don't necessarily put makeup on your hands, obviously. So there is going to be a disparity, especially if it's close to someone's face or whatever. But we wouldn't want to go completely crazy and have it exactly the same color as their face. So I'm just going to do a little bit down there where it was probably most off. So more there than we're going to do here, and just a tiny bit over there. And then finally just over in the corner there where the color gel is actually probably, correct me if I'm wrong Emily, just skewing the color off a little bit, so like so. If we turn our skin tone layer off, and I'll zoom in again, sorry Brandy, and turn skin tone on, then you can just see that small correction that it's made. But that's super easy to do. Any of you can do that. It's no problem really to manage to accomplish that in Capture One. It would be a lot harder to do that in Photoshop, as an example. Why does sliding the hue to the right make the color shift to the left on the color wheel? Well, I guess it's either going clockwise or counterclockwise. So it's got to go in one direction. So that's the direction we picked, I would assume. Let's just check for questions over in the Q&A panel. Let's see. If you pick a color, Jan is asking, from the skin tone and use the uniform sliders, does moving the dot from the picked color affect the uniform sliders? No, that's a really good question. What it does is affect your target color. So this is what everything has been, if you like, pulled towards. So if we change that, then it's going to change your target skin color. So let's do something really drastic so you can see. So if I go all the way over here, you can see exactly what it's doing. You can see where I've brushed because it's pulled all the colors to my pick color. So if I go back up here to roughly where it was, now it looks much better. So you can drag that dot around to fine tune the color. You've also got the amount sliders. So if you wanted to have an overall effect on the picked color, then you would use these sliders here. If you want to create uniformity within the range, then you can do that as well. Okay, I think we should move on. Otherwise, I will run out of time like before. So let's do a quick before and after. This was, you know, a small edit, but it was just a nice technique that we did with the color balance tool and the skin tone. Oh, and the hair as well. Speed edit on the hair. So I'm just going to make a new layer and we call this hair. We're not going to do any fancy tricks. We're going to grab a brush, max out the flow, probably make it a bit softer, and then we're just going to do a rough mask on the hair. You might spend a bit more time doing this, like so, and a bit over here as well. So you might want to finesse this a little bit more. And now if we grab our clarity slider, then you can see we can just get an enhancement in the lighter versus the darker areas of the hair strands as well. So that's just a really nice simple way to get a bit more definition like so. Because we didn't want to put clarity over the whole shot, that would have completely messed it up. And one comment was a bit overall brightness maybe, so let's push it up a little bit more. There we go. All right. Just checking questions. That's a good one. It's so much fun trying to match skin tone on someone with a farmer's tan. Guilty. Face one tone, arms other tone, and no shirt means yet another tone on the chest. Yep. There are limits, of course, but I would like to think the skin tone tool would certainly help you move into that direction as well. Okay, let's move on to another shot. Thanks for all the chat comments and so on, and for helping each other out as well. And yeah, a comment from Mike inside the webinar room. The skin tone tool also works great on sky variances. Definitely. I did an edit on Tuesday as part of our green competition that we've been running in one of the entries, and I used the skin tone tool to even out a range of green tones on one area, which I felt looked better as more even tones. So just because it's called skin tone doesn't mean you have to use it on skin tones. Ray Pan, what is exactly the right skin tone? Good question. There is no right skin tone, really. That's a very philosophical question in terms of what's the color grade you want to put on it. If we ask Brandy to jump on camera now, I'm sure her skin wouldn't look exactly the same as this. So it's the color grading, it's the makeup, it's the look you want to achieve, high key, low key, and so on. But there are no 3 RGB numbers that are a perfect skin tone, that's for sure. Okay, let's do this one. This is, I think, as it comes out of camera. And the reason why I picked this, it's a really good indication of the difference between exposure and brightness, and why using exposure to dodge and burn often doesn't work that well. It's also a good exercise, and this is John's edit. This is from a photographer, my buddy John Wildgoose, great name. And he was really the inspiration for me to remember darkroom techniques that I'd forgotten about, because I grew up in the darkroom and was very used to dodging and burning, making silly shapes with your hands under the enlarger, all that kind of stuff, and forgot about that really when digital editing started, because laziness, or it was less prevalent. But now, as it's so easy to do, it's really nice to bring those techniques back. And John was a good inspiration for me to do that, because you can see all his layers here. He really analyzes the picture and breaks it down quite nicely, and changing the light and shade to really enhance the photo. And I'd say the difference between this edited one is that our subject here on our deserted railway station stands out really nicely compared to the unedited one, where he's overall lost in the picture. Just saw that comment. Imagine you making funny hand shapes in the darkroom. Exactly. It's no fun, really. I do not miss the darkroom. Okay, so first of all, exposure's pretty good out the gate, so nothing too much to worry about there. So we need to compress down the photo a bit so we're focused on this gentleman. And we've got some brighter areas down the front, brighter areas at the top. So we need to just really shrink those tonal ranges down so we're more focused on our subject. I am going to crop it a tiny bit, like so. And I am going to pull the highlights down just to darken off those areas a touch, because they're a little bit on the hot side. This is fine because that gives a nice edge to him where he's bathed in light. Maybe we can enhance that further. But let's start by making a grad bottom, for want of a better word, and just pulling up our gradient mask down here. Now I'm going to align this roughly with the platform. And again, using our Option key or Alt key, if you're on a PC, just pull this down like so. So if I press M on my keyboard, then we can see what we're making. Let's do that. So it's a little bit on the bright side. So again, exposure and brightness, difference between the two here. If we pull down the exposure, this gets very black very quickly, because exposure is going to affect all the tones in the photo at the same rate. If we pull down brightness, that's going to have more of an effect on the mid-tone. So it's almost compressing this a little bit. So I personally feel if we take exposure down, so you see we're almost, if you look at our RGB numbers at the top, we're almost running out of detail there. And I don't think that would print very nice. It doesn't necessarily look as nice on screen. But if we bring the brightness down, we can pull down some of those midtones. We can still see some detail, but it's not getting as crunchy or as blocked up as it would with exposure. If anything, I would do a subtle bit of exposure and more brightness. So now that's taken some exposure out the bottom of the shot, so we're not distracted by that. Next thing is to do, oh, that says grand bottom, my goodness. Grad bottom. Let's do another one and we call that grad top. Similar thing, grab the gradient tool and go to something like that. But we're going to attack this in a second way as well. So let's just bring the brightness down a touch. And what we're going to do is that these little puddles of light are quite nice. So I don't want to get rid of those. So we're going to go to around here, but I do want to darken down the tops a bit more. So we're going to darken the top even more. That was one of John's layer names actually. So let's do that next. So we're going to make a new field adjustment layer. And again, let's say darken even more. We're going to look at the difference between exposure and brightness. So if I pull the exposure down, so this is again a filled layer. If I pull the exposure down, and imagine now what I want to do is just paint in or burn in some of the detail around here. So just darken that off. But using exposure, it's also going to darken these white struts to some extent as well. Whereas if we use brightness, it's going to have less of an effect. So when I brush this in, it's already doing some kind of automatic work for me because it's brushing around, if you want to think of it that way, those lighter areas. So it's going to have a more natural effect. There's nothing worse than looking at a shot that's been selectively darkened or burned in and it's obvious because you'll almost see these splodges and then it goes flat and it doesn't look good. It's like lacking in contrast. So if we do it this way, then it's going to be much more believable. For full control, you could also think about using a curve. So again, that's down in the 3/4 tone. So we could think, well, let's do that and make sure our highlights don't darken as well. And that looks a little bit aggressive, but again, we're going to brush it in with flow. So let's try that and see if that works. So let's clear that mask. We're going to grab our brush once more. And I'm looking to paint in little wells of light like so. So once again, if I had my flow at 100 and I started brushing, looks pretty terrible and very obvious. So that's why we don't have flow at 100. So we're going to turn this right down. Probably going to make this softer. And now what we're going to do is just brush in where we see fit. Now, if it's not happening fast enough, then there's nothing to stop you then bumping up the flow a little bit as well. But what I'm going to do is just darken off these areas. And as I said, if I'd been using exposure, these white struts would have been darkened down somewhat as well. And then it becomes really obvious what's going on. So let's just darken down those corners like so. So now if we turn off darken even more, it's just doing a little bit to the top like that, but we're enhancing these little puddles of light, which I think look quite nice. If you want to make it more aggressive, then of course you could play around with the curve a bit more. You could introduce another adjustment, like if we pull the brightness down, you can see what's happening. If we pull exposure down, you can really see now how that's gone mucky because it's also darkening those. So that's why I wouldn't use exposure on this, but let's darken it off like so. And if you've gone too far, then we can always bring our opacity down or back up as well. Now this same brush that is almost like a darken mid-tone brush or darken 3/4 tone brush to some extent, we might find it useful elsewhere. So if I just brush over here and enhance that triangle, which is almost behind this guy, to darken that off a bit more. Is it doing much? Let's turn. Yeah, it's just doing a little bit like so. And again, I'd probably darken off the edge of this platform here and the edge of the platform there, and just some of that in the background. And if I wanted to make this a bit darker, we could probably handle that. I'm talking about, this is a taxi ramp apparently. I might just pull the blacks down a bit like so. So the blacks is the very darkest tone, so that will just richen up that paintwork a little bit. Now for our fella here, he's nicely silhouetted around it, but I might be tempted to brighten him a tiny bit, just so he stands out. So once again, what I'll do is I'll make a new field adjustment layer and think about the kind of adjustments that are going to brighten him. So I won't do exposure, because if I'm sloppy with my brushing, that's going to brighten the already bright area behind him. So I'm going to pick adjustments that are focused just on the kind of tones that he's wearing, if you like. So he's a mid-tone, he's a shadow. So if we lift up the shadows, that does a pretty good job of brightening him up. So I'll push it more than I would use. Clear the mask, grab our brush. Going to need a much tinier brush, and then we can open up the shadows a little bit along the side like so. So he's not disappearing into shadow completely. If we turn this layer off and back on, then we can see the difference. And I'm not worried about being sloppy and brushing onto this area around here, because the shadow slider is not really going to affect that so much. So even though my mask is most likely all over the place to some extent, it's not going to affect what's going on here, because the adjustment is not targeted to that. So don't get too obsessed with making your mask super perfect. Generally, they don't have to be. Okay. Let's look at the before and after. So there's before. There's after. Again, fairly subtle, but now he's popping out from the background a little bit more than it was. The only thing I might do is that, I'm going to look at John's edit in a minute, is perhaps even crop that off, but maybe that's too severe. What did John do actually? If all else fails, what did the photographer who's responsible do? So he darkened it off even more, so he stood out even more as well. So we're fairly close, but you can see the difference between our two. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of questions and see where we're going to go for there. Right. Great edit, David. Oh, thank you. You've given the image dimension and taken away flatness. I can't really take credit for it. I was pretty much drawn inspiration from John over there. Okay, couple of people have been asking about luminosity masks. Sometimes they're certainly useful. In this case, I don't think I would really find use for it. And generally the process of painting in the adjustments where you see fit, I find more enjoyable. That's important. And often faster than sometimes using a luminosity mask. But if you have a situation where a luminosity mask will clearly define an area that you want to target that would be difficult to mask by hand, then I would absolutely use a luminosity mask. So again, every tool for the job. A couple of people asking about the difference between flow and opacity as well. The main difference between those, flow and opacity, quite a big difference really, is that opacity, if you like, sets the upper limit for the opacity of your mask. Flow is the rate at which you will arrive at that opacity. So let's say we had an exposure of +1 on a layer. and we had a flow of 100, as soon as I brush that in, like you saw when I did the first brush up here, as soon as we brush that in, you would hit one exposure, sorry, plus one stop change straight away. If we had opacity down at 50-ish and flow at 100, when I started brushing, we would be at half a stop immediately of adjustment that I've brushed in, if we had a layer with a plus one stop adjustment. If we put flow down to 1 or 2 or something like that, this will limit the amount of adjustment that is laid down or painted onto the photo, whatever analogy sits best within your mind, per brush stroke. So with flow at 4 as it is on screen right now, every brush stroke would be 4% until we reached our maximum opacity of 100. So that would gradually build in the adjustment with all those brush strokes until we hit our max opacity, in this case at 100, which would then be plus one stop. If opacity was now down at 50, we would never ever get to plus one stop because opacity would max it out at that point. So flow just allows you to build up your adjustment slowly so you can then put the brakes on it nicely and decide at what point it makes sense to stop. Because very rarely, like you saw with that ugly splodge I brushed in at the corner, very rarely it looks good if you're firing all the adjustment on a layer like so. There's no finesse to it. But David, you forgot to name your layer. Yes, I did. What even was this? The man. There we go. That was Brandy's sneaky comment in the background. The final layer which John did on this, John is a really diligent cleaner-upper. And I won't go through, you can see all the points that he's cleaned up. I won't go through all of those, but this is a good case for using the brush shortcut. So if we wanted to clean up some of these distractions down here, I would grab my healing brush, and instead of right clicking and changing the size, I would use the keyboard shortcut. Now, if you have a Wacom, sometimes it interferes with the little heads up display. So you see that heads up display? So I'm holding down, let's just turn on overhead keyboard. So we've got control option, like so. And if I click, drag left and right, then we can change the size of the cursor. But with Wacom, for some reason, their driver interferes with the little heads up display that you saw. And sometimes it doesn't show up, which is super annoying. I do need to update the driver, so maybe that's part of it. But drag left and right, I'm dragging on my trackpad. If I do it on the Wacom, you can see it as well. So if I drag left and right, then it changes the brush size. But it also moves the brush. It's another weird thing with the driver. But if we're using a mouse, where is my mouse? Turned off. If you're using mouse or a trackpad, oh, there we go, it's back. Then you get the heads up display like so. So if I drag left and right, we can make the brush bigger. If I go up and down, we can change the hardness. So as I was saying, let's turn that off. As I was saying, if you're doing a cleanup, then it makes sense to use that shortcut because then it becomes nice and speedy if you need to use a bigger brush. So if I wanted to do a bigger brush for this rubbish here, then I could just use that shortcut. So again, for this mark down here, like so, I'm going to make my brush smaller, paint this out, let's paint that out, let's paint that out. As I said, John is very observant about all the various different distractions and so on. So there we go. That's a really good use case of that. Saw that question. When to use the airbrush option? No clue, actually. I've never used it in my life, so I don't know, to be perfectly honest. Airbrush builds up over time, as opposed to flow is movement based. So I guess if you wanted to paint an adjustment on one spot and hold the brush there, gradually moving it, maybe it would work, but I don't find it useful. So sorry about that. All right, we better go to this shot before I'm even slower than I was earlier. Jeez. So, but you guys have asked lots of good questions, so that's why. Let's look at this one. So this is by Robin Cena, a lovely photographer in the UK, shot with a equally lovely Leica. Now, this has a little bit more work to do but nothing drastic at all. It's just slightly underexposed. And this is a case where I would use exposure, because it does make sense to shift all the tones to a brighter level. So let's pull the exposure up. Looking at our levels, I would probably stop around here and hit auto levels, and that's just going to set my shadow and highlight points nicely. Now this area is a bit bright and a bit distracting, but we can pull that down with highlights, no problem whatsoever. And in terms of fixing the photo, job done, so we could stop there. What I think would be nice would be to have some clarity. But the issue on this photo with adding clarity is that it ruins the lovely out of focus soft background. So I think it looks quite good on her, but not so good on the background. It's too much. So we want to separate that out. So we could start by drawing a mask on her, or we do it my method, which is somewhat backwards, which is the new field adjustment layer, and then dialing in the level of adjustment you would like. So I'm going to have a bit of clarity. I might also add some extra highlight recovery to see if it takes the face down a bit, but it doesn't, so there's not much point. So we just stick with clarity, and sharpness wise, a little bit of structure as well, but not too much. So now that is globally applied, that clarity, but as I said, I don't really like what it does to the background. So we're going to clear that mask, and we're going to call that clarity face. And we're going to do a similar thing. Now I'll probably push flow up a bit stronger here, because I don't mind if it comes in quickly, because I want it to be fairly aggressive. So then we can just brush in clarity where we want to have it. Could even go stronger, like so. And if we turn clarity off, you can see what that's doing. So just a little slight improvement on contrast, but we still get the lovely nice out of focus bokeh background and so on. The only other thing, or two other things that I want to do for this picture, is a small radial mask. And again, the way we use the radial mask is quite interesting here, or the adjustments that we put in to change the exposure of a radial mask. Very often you think exposure is the right move, but it's not on this case. I'm just going to bump up clarity a touch more as well. So if we turn that off and on, that looks good. So we're going to make our radial, or vignette, whatever you want to call it. Grab our radial cursor, this one here. And a good tip, where you start drawing means the radial expands out from the center. So it's not the edge you're drawing it from, it will burst out from the center. So if you want the center of your radial to be around here, which I do, then as you start drawing, it will expand out from that point. Same with the linear gradient. We can change our fall off. We can move it around. We can't make it asymmetric. So it's always 150 0 in terms of fall off. So now if I want to darken the edges a bit, the common thing to do is just start playing with exposure, because I want to make something darker, so let's pull exposure down. So if we pull exposure down, probably not that much, then what I don't like is that the darker areas, so this little bit of shadow here, this shadow just over her shoulder, gets too dark, because again, exposure is going to bring all those tones down by the same amount, and that vignette becomes, it's almost too harsh, it's too obvious, something doesn't look right. So if we bring brightness down instead, or probably even better a curve, which we'll look at in a minute, that's just going to pull the midtones down, and we're not getting such a harsh look as we did before. And if you want to be even more critical or pedantic, whatever you want to call it, we could think, well, I just want to darken my midtones a touch, but let's not kill all the shadow detail, like so. So this will give you much more control. So if we turn our radial vignette off and back on again, then you can do so. Now you can also put a luma range on top of that vignette if you wanted to cut out some tonal ranges. Generally that's a bit overkill because the adjustment you can put on can be tailored to the tonal range that you want to adjust, but you can slap a luminosity mask on top of a radial if you wish. So I would stick with that. Now going back to the background, I might just up the exposure a bit more. If you make any post-exposure changes, just make sure you haven't messed anything up with the levels, that you haven't clipped. So if I click on auto once more, just to make sure I haven't done anything. Now the only last thing to do is that her eyes are disappearing into shadow. I assume it's somewhat backlit. So if we make a new eye layer, eyes, actually let's fill it, and we want to open up this area a bit. There's probably not much detail in there, so if I lift the shadows you can see we can see a bit more in there, but we don't want it to go flat and nasty, so let's put some bit of clarity back in. Now that's obviously too much for the whole shot, but if I clear the mask, grab a brush, and I would be very careful here with flow and just open it up a tiny bit. The right eye, left eye, probably a touch more than this one, which is another good use case for flow because we can apply the same adjustment stronger in one area compared to another. And if you want to see the difference, if we turn on our display grayscale mask, you can see it's brighter here, which means we're applying more of the adjustment compared to the left-hand side here. So that's another benefit of using flow. It makes an adjustment on the photo more flexible because it can be applied in varying strengths across the shot. Okay, let's come out of that. You can find your display grayscale mask here, or the shortcut, or M for mask as well. So Mark said, can you desaturate for a second? Let's just turn the eyes on and off. Go in a bit closer. So that's without the adjustment, and with just a little bit, not too much. It just opens it up ever so slightly. And in fact, I think it's too much. Again, the benefit of opacity is that we can retrospectively tweak our adjustments. Mark wants to see it black and white. So let's just turn on black and white. Not bad, not bad. I would probably just add, not using, sorry, wrong. I would probably go for a more contrasty black and white, but with a bit more finesse than that. But actually, looks quite nice in black and white as well. Good tip. If I was being David, I tend to prefer lower saturation. So I'd probably even end up with something like that, personal preference. All right, well, we did actually, I was not as efficient as I was this morning, damn it. So we got through, oh no, we did get through 4 photos. There we go. I thought I'd only done 3, but we managed 4, not 5. This shot, also from Robin, very similar if we just look at the layer stack out here. Same thing with the radial mask. If we look at, that's just brightness. So if we turn the radial mask on and off, if we'd done the same thing with exposure, it gets way too dark up here too quickly. So then in that case, I would rather pull the radial down with brightness, or once again, drop the midtones a bit, make sure the shadows aren't too dark. We've got a little brighten slight just on the center of her face. We've got a darken just on this area, that was a tad too bright. And then adding some detail, that was just a bit more sharpening in this area. So similar techniques to what you've seen or did see throughout the rest of the transmission. Okay, let's finish off with a couple of questions. Super Makito, thanks for the tip. I always use exposure for vignettes. And sometimes it works. Like if you had a relatively even background, it can look fine. But once you start dropping into the shadows, because even here that's getting a bit strong for my liking, I would just pull this up a bit more, or that might even be a case where I would put a luminosity mask on just to avoid the darkest shadows, or we could pull up the black slider a bit as well. So we still get our radial mask look, but we're not doing anything nasty in crushing the blacks. So don't be afraid to go positive with this slider, the blacks, even if you've gone negative or you've created a curve. Yes, Mark, we did desaturate for a quick minute. I think it would look quite nice. Just checking for common questions. Oh, Rob says that photo would look great in black and white. There we go. Brandy didn't know something was an option. Hopefully it was useful. Oh, the airbrush one. Yeah, if anyone has a useful use for airbrush, please let me know. I'm sure there is. It's just not something I've found personally to be useful. That's all. So looking over in the webinar room, Diego's done great answering a million questions. Thanks to Yulia over on Facebook as well. I think we are pretty good. Let's have a look. Is there any trick to make a Wacom tablet recognize and make it work in Mac OS? Generally, I have to say, even though I was a bit mean about the Wacom there, generally it works very well. If it's not showing up, and you can see it here, if it's not showing up, then generally, if you're on Catalina or later or Big Sur, it's probably a permissions issue. Wacom needs to have access to certain things, so just check on the security preferences in particular, and then you'll probably find a whole bunch of stuff there that you need to activate. All right, so thanks for joining us today. Sorry we overran a little bit, and sorry we couldn't answer a whole bunch of questions. Then it wouldn't even have been 4 edits, it would have been 2 edits probably. So I hope you found that informative and interesting. If you want to join us again, we're back next week on a Thursday, I believe, where we're editing landscapes. So that will also be on YouTube if you're watching us on YouTube and want to come back there. When you exit the webinar, if you haven't left already, then you'll also be presented with the sign up page for that. So you can always sign up straight away or catch it same time next week on YouTube. You can already see it scheduled on YouTube as well. And yes, Mike, it is recorded. Any of these that we broadcast live go straight to YouTube. They live there for eternity, I would say. They will have a relatively long countdown until it gets trimmed, but you can always fast forward if need be. But they will be there straight away. Thanks for joining, everybody, and see you all in the future, I hope, and enjoy your weekends. Take care, everyone. Bye now.